welcome to week 4. Yeah, 4 of All About Bannock. So over the past few weeks, we've done a couple different topics. We've done our town tour where we talked, all about the history of Bannock and some of the people and the stories. And then we did our park lore and we talked about the vigilantes and the outlaws. And then we did the cemeteries and talked about the cemeteries of Bannock. So overall, we've had kind of a common theme of a lot of death. So we thought, you know what, let's switch it up a little bit this week. So we're going to talk about food and drink. So I thought this would be a good topic to kind of do a deep dive into because food and drink are such a universal theme, and it's a really good way for us to get a better idea of what it was like to live in Bannock and what the people that lived here experienced, especially those first people here. So food and drink in the early 1800s were not very accessible. It was really hard to come by those things out here. So especially out in these rural communities and in these mining towns, food and drink were really only available if you brought it or if you produced it in some way. So we're currently standing in Dr. Ryburn's kitchen, so a good setting to talk about food. So in the early days of Bannock, when people were first traveling out here, they were often traveling on their covered wagons and wagon trains. So they had to pack all the food that they were going to eat along the way. And we've talked about Governor Edgerton in our town tour, and he came out here with his family. One of those family members was Lucia Darling, his niece, and in her journal, she wrote about their experience and the food that they ate along the way. So she said that as they were traveling out west, they, quote, succeeded in cutting a ham to fry, making coffee, and getting together milk, sugar, etc. for our breakfast. So they were traveling from Ohio out to Bannock. So Mary Edgerton, Governor Edgerton's wife, brought a lot of different food items on the trip out here, some that we wouldn't necessarily consider super important. They brought things like butter and lemonade. Butter would be really hard to keep without any form of refrigeration on the way here, so they ate it very quickly. Other than the people coming out on wagon trains, of course, the first people that were coming here were miners, and they tended to travel very light, only packing their essentials, so they didn't usually bring a lot of food with them from, gold strike to mining camp, etc. So when they got here, they really quickly would have to find food sources. Oh my God. So there's a great quote about miners in early Bannock. They were in that chronic state of miners, out of provisions, and knowing that they could not live off of gold. They were just starting for Salt Lake City when a Mr. Woodmansey rolled into the valley with several wagon loads of provisions, including a full supply of Valley Tan or Mormon whiskey, which caused the camp to become hilarious with joy. So when people were first moving into Bannock, they couldn't actually grow food here. The soil here is very rocky. This is high desert, so it's very dry. And our winters last a very long time. So we're at a very high elevation. So it was constantly far too cold to actually grow fruits and vegetables here. There are a few root vegetables that can grow here, but it's very minimal. So the way that they would usually eat is by preserving their food in some way. So they would often either preserve things like meat and salt, or they would can or pickle or preserve things. Dried fruit was very common, but it was hard to get fresh fruits or vegetables. Of course, once Bannock had established as a town, you could start purchasing food here. But all of the food that you could buy here had to be brought in from places like Salt Lake City, Fort Benton, Walla Walla, Washington, basically bigger centers of food production or trade. And so they would ship food out to Bannock, but the shipping costs were so high that they caused the cost of food here to be so inflated. So purchasing food was really expensive. But of course, things like flour and sugar really always had to be shipped in. The first winter of 1862 that people were living here in Bannock was actually a very mild winter, so they were able to ship in quite a bit of food. But the next few years following 1862, those were incredibly harsh winters and led to a lot of food shortages. Mary Edgerton, Governor Edgerton's wife, wrote a lot of letters back to her family, and she often talked about food. In one of her letters, she talked about the prices of food and how they were very expensive. As you can see in this quote from Mary, she is stating that flour costs $38 in gold for a 100-pound sack and that sugar is $1 a pound. To put that into perspective, today $1 is equivalent to $25 in 1862. In 1865, when she was writing this, the modern dollar was equivalent to about $16. Things that cost $1 today would be worth about 6 cents back then. So that $38 worth of flour today would be about $597. So if you wanted to buy 4 pounds of sugar, it would be roughly $62 today. People often bought in bulk because they didn't usually live near a store. But people learned to adjust and to do without certain things out here. I do not make much cake. I have almost forgotten how it tastes. Now, don't think that I am finding fault because I can't have such things as I have spoken of. We don't think of them very often, only when we are talking about the folks at home. We are perfectly contented without them. And then about a year later, in another letter, she said, Mr. Edgerton has just brought me a peach. We can buy 3 for $1. Don't you think they are cheap? We have had a present last week of some potatoes and turnips that were raised near Virginia City. So between these two letters from 2 different years, you can really start to see the difference in accessibility of food out here in Bannock. So they would have to hunt for a lot of their food. There are moose and elk and deer, even bear, that they could eat out here. There were smaller animals like rabbits and beaver. Beaver was considered a delicacy, specifically the tail, because it is all fat. And that was eaten a lot on the Lewis and Clark expeditions, actually. So it was also very common to fish during that time. In Bannock, we have the Grasshopper Creek that runs through here, but we're also very close to a lot of big rivers. The main thing that people were fishing for at the time was the cutthroat trout. Today there are a lot more types of trout, but those are not native to this area. So one thing that was fairly easy to get out here was beef. Johnny Grant was a rancher out here, and ranching did predate mining in this area. But when miners started to come out, it created much more of a market for their beef. And he was eventually bought out by the butcher here in town, Conrad Coors. So now that you know a little bit more about getting food out here, it's kind of easy to have the first impression that, well, you know, they were eating very basic foods. They weren't eating a lot of processed food like we do today. They were definitely taking in less calories, but we wouldn't want to assume then that those people were necessarily healthier than we are today. So in the 1860s, since people were receiving less nutrients, people were a lot shorter back then. So for reference, I am 5'6". I am the average height for a male in the US in the 1860s. To put that into perspective, the average height for men today in the US is around 5'9", 5'10". The average height for women today is 5'4". There isn't very good data about the average height of women during the 1860s, but it is assumed that it was most likely around 5 foot or 5'1". So people in general were just much smaller. And again, that's not necessarily that they were much healthier, it's just that they physically couldn't grow as big. Life expectancy was also much less during that time. The average lifespan for men during this time was about 40 to 45 years old. That data is fairly skewed because, of course, this is during the Civil War. A lot of men are dying very young, but even still, people didn't live as long as they do today. And the understanding of nutrition was very basic at the time. There were actually packing lists for families coming out on covered wagons, and it listed all the, items and food things that they suggested to bring along with you during your trip. And they said specifically that, so this is out of the book Idaho, 6 Months in the New Gold Regions, The Emigrant's Guide, which was published in the mid-1800s. So they stated that, quote, "We have observed a very great difference as to the health of parties. Those who use meats and little or no fruit incline to the scurvy, while those who use fruits and very little bacon or meat never have it." So, while not much about nutrition and diet was necessarily known at the time, scurvy was a very common issue, and while they didn't know exactly why, they did understand how basically to fix it, which was eating certain fruits and vegetables and getting certain vitamins. So as Bannack developed and really became an established town, there was actually a fair amount of diversity and food diversity here. Miners came from all, cultures and backgrounds, and so when they would come to these mining towns, they would bring their, their culture and their heritage and their food with them. In 1895, we actually had a Chinese restaurant here in town. And as the town grew, more and more food was being shipped in. In 1878, there was a newspaper article that said, "Pat Dempsey is receiving regular consignments of fresh Baltimore oysters, and the lovers of those palatable bivalves have been enjoying rich treats." And the last restaurant that we had here in Bannack was called the Last Chance Cafe. The building is still standing, and that closed most likely in the mid-1900s. So another thing that people really struggled to get while out here in Bannack was fresh water. Fresh drinking water did not just come out of a tap, and the creek was not necessarily clean water to drink. There were a lot of waterborne illnesses that people would contract, such as cholera, E. coli, typhoid, giardia, which could lead to dysentery, and these diseases would kill a lot of people throughout the history of Bannack. If you remember in the cemetery video, I mentioned the first person to ever die here died of typhoid. So the thing that would be safe to drink here was alcohol, specifically beer, because it had been treated. So when people first got to Bannack, they really had to rely on either just drinking the water out of the stream and hoping for the best, or by having some kind of alcohol or treated drink that was safe. After a little while, they started to dig wells, and then they had more safe drinking water, but especially those first people here really struggled to find safe things to drink. Because of that, alcohol was then consumed by pretty much all people, even at all ages. There's stories here of people treating babies with whiskey to help with teething and things like that. So alcohol was extremely common. And right now, of course, we are in Skinner's Saloon, which is our last remaining saloon, but Bannack did have multiple saloons over time. And as we discussed in the town tour, these saloons were a real center to socialize. You could drink and talk and dance and listen to music and play card games. Because the goods that people needed to survive out here were so hard to come by, like we talked about in Dr. Ryburn's house with accessing food, things had to, of course, be shipped here. And that included hard liquor, specifically whiskey. So what a lot of saloons would do is they would take, the 1 barrel of whiskey that they got, or however many, and they would actually split it up into multiple barrels to try and increase their supply. So, of course, if they separated 1 barrel into multiple, they would add water to increase the amount, but that would dilute it. So then they would add different things to increase its potency. They would often add tobacco. They would also often add things like strychnine, which, yes, is a poison. So if you've ever used certain kinds of rat poison or read any novel about murder, you've probably heard about strychnine. And it is extremely potent. And in big enough doses, it can kill people and animals very quickly, within a few hours. So it was often said that if people drank too much out of the bottom of the barrel, it could kill them because all of the substances would settle and it would get so strong. So it could be very tricky back then because, yes, drinking, stream water that wasn't treated could cause a lot of disease and could be very dangerous. But so could be drinking, the beer and the alcohol that was produced here, because really up until the 20th century, there was no way to actually test the alcohol content of a drink. So another place that you could get alcohol in Bannack was at a brewery. So today breweries are super popular, especially in Montana. We have close to 70 local breweries in operation. And the first one in Montana was here at Bannack. It's no longer standing, but it stood roughly in this area of where our parking lot is today. That first brewery was called the Mannheim Brewery. It was opened by John Mannheim in 1862. He most likely only operated his brewery here in Bannack for about a year before moving on to Virginia City, where there was a larger economy. But other people did take over this brewery. It was eventually the French Brewery and then the Harvey Brewery as well. Having a local brewery at the time had a lot of pros and cons. Of course, the pros were that you had more access to alcohol and whatever they were producing, whether that was whiskey or beer, but the breweries also took a toll on the food supply. So the main crops that they were using, such as wheat and barley, and of course hops, that could have been used for food, but instead it was going to the production of beer. So it could have a negative impact on the community that it was serving. So we've talked about food and drink, but of course there were a lot of other substances that people were consuming at this time that I just want to briefly touch on. So medicine at the time was fairly rudimentary. Not a lot was known about certain substances that people would consume. So things that we would consider hard or dangerous drugs today were much more common and accessible back in the mid to late 1800s and even into the early 1900s. So things such as cocaine and morphine and opium and a lot of different forms of poison were actually fairly common during that time. The main thing though that people were using as medicine were herbs. So when those first miners and those first families were coming out to Bannack, they needed to adapt very quickly and they needed to learn how to survive. And they heavily relied on a lot of Native Americans and a lot of their knowledge of this area. So a lot of herbs and roots that the Native Americans used were quickly picked up by new settlers here. So things like peppermint and uva ursa and skunk root and camas and bitterroot, all of these flowers and herbs and things that grew here were being used more and more by new people coming here. Of course, one of the main plants here is sagebrush, which is very toxic. But the two herbs that were definitely the most common in this area are camas and bitterroot. So both of them have a lot of properties. Camas can be cooked and eaten. It was often added to different teas to be used as a cough syrup. The leaves could even be used as a building material for things like pillows and mattresses. Bitterroot, which today is our state flower, also had a lot of important properties that Native Americans used back then and still do today. The bitterroot itself is very nutritious. It has a lot of nutrients. Consuming that could be very beneficial to someone's health, especially since people were often lacking nutrients. It also was often used for different heart conditions. It could help relieve heartburn and was often used to treat people who had like cardiac failure or heart attack, things like that. When people started to move out here, of course, they brought with them a lot of the medicines that were popular at the time. These are what we often refer to as patent medicines. So in this case behind me, we have a display showing some different medicines that people would use at the time. These medicines, though, were often very rudimentary and would either not work or they would basically work too well, aka they were highly addictive drugs. Some of the things you can see in there are Burnett's cocaine, scalp and dandruff treatment, which doesn't actually contain any cocaine, it was coconut oil. There are laxatives that contain alcohol. There are painkillers with poisonous ingredients such as belladonna, which is also known as nightshade. So some of these medicines in small doses could actually relieve side effects of different diseases, and in some ways could be helpful, but often in too large of a dose would have a lot of side effects. Now, one drug that was fairly common at the time was mercury or mercury pills. These were often referred to as bilious pills, and people would take them and the body reacts by causing extreme diarrhea because it wants to get the mercury out of your system. So Lewis and Clark, during their expedition, actually would take mercury pills quite a bit. Often when someone felt that they were getting sick, they would take a mercury pill, and that would flush everything out of the body, and they assumed that it would also flush any disease that you could have. It's called Rush's Thunderbolts. So that can kind of give you an idea of what those pills would do to your body. So we know that Lewis and Clark did consume mercury pills, interestingly enough, because at Travelers Rest State Park, they were actually able to prove that Lewis and Clark came through that area because of the mercury samples in the soil where they would often dig latrines. So Travelers Rest State Park is the only archaeologically verified campsite of Lewis and Clark, mostly due to the mercury in the soil along with some other artifacts that were found there. So if you are interested in that, I highly recommend checking out Travelers Rest State Park to learn a little bit more about Lewis and Clark. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about life in Bannack and the people that lived here. Join us again next week. Thanks.